The Gonzaga Socratic Club, it confuses people all the time that we are the Gonzaga Socratic Club. People think, oh, club, so this is a club organization. Well, not exactly. We take our name from the Oxford Socratic Club, which was presided over by the well-known Christian apologist C.S. Lewis during the 1940s and 50s at Oxford University before he took his final university position at Cambridge, right toward the end of his life. And the Oxford Socratic Club was started as a forum for students and faculty to talk about what I would use a phrase they didn't use in the mid-1900s. I would talk about Christian worldview issues. And one of the fascinating things about the Socratic Club at Oxford was that it involved not only defenders and apologists for Christianity, but also very harsh critics. And we tried to get some of that here at Gonzaga at the Socratic Club in looking at topics like the problem of evil, the concept of God, Christianity and science, and so on and so forth. So we meet about once a month during the school term, and we have speakers both from on campus and off campus. I suspect many of you are here because you're interested in the particular topic of the Socratic Club today, which is Christianity and politics, or if we take our speaker's more pointed version of the title, it's Barak versus Mitt, what would Jesus do? So if that's not controversial enough, I don't know. Our speaker today is Dr. Michael Leiserson, who has degrees from Princeton and his PhD from Yale, which he received in 1966. He came to Gonzaga in 1977, where he was a professor here, and was promoted to full professor in 1991 and retired in 2010. Although I've kept an email conversation on and off with Dr. Leiserson, and in one he commented, well, I haven't really retired. I've experienced a change in vocation, and I'm now something like a Benedictine in a monastery without walls. So he's been thinking about problems linking his discipline of political science to issues in theism and political philosophy. He's been thinking about these issues for many years, and in his so-called retirement, he's been working on a project that we're going to get a taste of here in the presentation for today. Does everyone have a handout? There are handouts went around. Okay, very good. And with that, let's welcome our speaker then, Dr. Michael Leiserson.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you for the invitation to be here. Grateful. This is the first chance I've had to try to tell some other people about the work I've been doing, and so I'm looking forward to getting your reactions after the talk. I'll sit down there and be taking notes because I really want to know how it sounds to you. I do have to admit, I got this, I thought I was for once ready ahead of time, and I sat down this afternoon to read it through just to make sure it was okay. And what I found out was that I'd gotten through about half of the outline and I was already over 40 minutes. So I'm going to have to prune this drastically. I can tell you what I'm going to do right now, and it might be helpful if I do. The first page of your handout should say, how can Christian philosophy inform politics, or Barak versus Mitt? Well, if you've got that. I'm going to completely omit Roman numerals 2 and 3 because they are in your outline. Everything I intended to say there, I actually typed out. So you will, if you're interested, you can read that when you go home. But I had to cut something. I'd sum up what I was going to spend a long time showing you is that I think it really does make sense to say modern culture and the modern university, including paradoxically Gonzaga, are officially atheist in the classroom outside of religious studies. And when we are atheists, we although most atheists don't realize this, we lose values and especially meaning as objects of knowledge, at the same time as we lose the gardener in John Wisdom's famous parable of the invisible gardener, who methods of science couldn't detect. That's all written down here, and so I'm just going to say that's what the first few pages that I've typed up, that's the argument that they summarize, I hope clearly. And then what I want to talk about is how, after I myself got that kind of training and learned to see the world through the eyes of science. I was a mathematical political scientist and applied the mathematical theory of games to politics in Western Europe, the US, and Japan. And I'll mention that just briefly. And at a certain point, I realized that what I was interested in the real world wasn't coming through in my mathematical model. And so I went through a period of struggle and so forth, which I'll talk about. And what I'm going to do in Roman numeral 4, that's a number of examples of things that I found as I was teaching political science, that they were true, students got a lot out of them, they were meaningful, but by the standards of political science, as I learned it, they're just subjective. And I'm going to explain that to you. And then I'm going to break into philosophy in Roman numeral 5, 6, and come back to politics in Roman numeral 7. I realized that a real subtitle for this talk would be something like, How a Scientist Was Dragged Kicking and Screaming into Metaphysics. So that's what we're doing with the outline. I want to begin the talk on a personal note, actually a confession. I retired 2 years ago, as David said, because I really wanted to understand the philosophical and religious foundation of politics and everything else, including my own life. That has happened to some extent. It's the source of what I want to share with you this afternoon. But I've also learned something else, which I didn't expect, that I shortchanged my students. I wasn't the risk taker here at Gonzaga that I'd been when I began teaching at UC Berkeley in the late 1960s. Then I pushed the envelope, experimenting with non-traditional ways of teaching and grading, teaching stuff that was far outside the discipline of political science when I thought it was relevant. But I got fired. And I was unemployed for 2 years, and then for 5 years when I could find a job teaching, it was only temporary part-time positions at half pay. Because, as I found out later, I'd been blackballed by the people who fired me. So I couldn't get a regular job anywhere in California, or any place those people could influence as far away as Wisconsin. Fortunately for me, they couldn't influence Gonzaga. So I came here. But I was a changed person. I was afraid. Although I taught well enough to receive a Teacher of the Year award once, I stopped being the risk taker I had been and allowed myself to teach within the limits of my discipline. That way I received tenure. And then, actually, I felt duty bound to continue to be the person that had received tenure. Understandable, but I ceased to pursue truth without limits. And in that sense, I let my students down. I never taught them the full meaning of politics, and I didn't even admit that I wasn't doing that. So you might say in this talk, I'm doing penance. If I could sum up what I want to say in one sentence, it might be this. We can't reasonably choose between Barak and Mitt in this election until we know what our presidential elections mean. Now, that might seem obvious. You might say everybody in this room knows perfectly well what presidential elections mean. And in a sense, it is. If a Socrates came along and asked you the right questions, you might even be able to say it. The way Socrates got a boy with no training in mathematics to discover the Pythagorean theorem in the Meno. I bet most of you could probably say why our presidential elections do not mean the same thing as presidential elections in communist China, or presidential elections in a parliamentary democracy, like Italy, where they have a prime minister, or the election of the GSPA president, or the election of the new pope. But to really understand how it's different and what the difference means requires, in my opinion, understanding that the same kind of knowing that enables us to know that God exists is also needed to know that the common good exists and that other values and goods are real, objective facts, even though not quantitative, not discernible by experimental methods, anything. And so, for example, I would say to understand, really understand what our presidential elections mean, you have to know answers to these questions. What was our country made for? In what sense is it and are we under God? Are the truths that the Declaration of Independence says we hold as self-evident actually true? What is our constitutional political system for? What is its end, or telos? Is it what the Constitution's preamble says? Is that a guide to what we're for? What is our common good? A term that you very rarely hear used anymore. What virtues are needed in a president? And of course, why and how do our presidential elections achieve these things? Sometimes. As far as I know, the discipline of political science, and I believe all the human sciences and the humanities, do not claim to know these realities, in the sense that they could give a test on any Gonzaga graduate and they would give the correct, sane answer to all those questions. You might say, you get an essay question in which you argue your point of view persuasively, you get an A. But knowledge? Unheard of. Now, the reason why, I believe, we no longer in our culture talk about the common good as something you can know is because science can, natural science, its methods, can't know it. And in our culture, the methods of natural science are normative. Think of the presidential debates. Do Obama and Romney refer to English lit professors as authorities for their programs? Or do they refer to economists, the most quantitative and scientific of all the social sciences? You know the answer. I'm not going to say more about that. That's a whole argument. It is what's in these pages here, and I'd be happy to go into it afterwards, of course, in the question period. I want to turn to how I slowly and gradually learned in the course of teaching that values and meaning can be ascertained in fact by good judgment. Something that actually every one of you, I bet, believes. But if you pause to think about it, you know probably you'd have a hard time showing, proving why you know it, really know it, as opposed to believing it or having it as your opinion. I just want to take one of these examples. All five of them I could talk about at great length because each one of them represents a whole course for me. The police, who are actually public administrators, if you think about it, bureaucrats, can be explain what a good cop is. On the Supreme Court, law professors fairly regularly talk about certain opinions as excellent, good, fair, abominable. Bush v. Gore. Universally, 98% of them. Faculty in law school agree it's a terrible opinion. Judgments are made. I became convinced, teaching common law and civil liberties for several years, that that's a kind of knowing. It's not just subjective opinion. I'll do a lot about the practice of law. In elections, I could talk to you for a long time about Lincoln. A marvelous book was written by an Aristotelian philosopher called Harry Jaffa, Crisis of the House Divided, in which he explains how good a politician Douglas was and how excellent, what virtues were required for Lincoln to defeat him. Extraordinary story. The only one I'm going to go into is the practice of law. I want to just briefly, in 5 minutes or so, explain to you in what sense it seems to be true that lawyers and other people, if they're interested, can know what a good lawyer is, and why there is a traditional notion, an ideal that used to be called the lawyer-statesman ideal. An ideal that, for example, Lincoln and many other 19th and early 20th century political leaders believed in. It goes like this. As soon as you go to law school, you find out that your professor teaching the case method expects you to read up on a case or read the opinions on a case and then be able to answer questions from either side. Now you arrive at law school thinking, of course, that you're for your values. You're all prepared to argue that, and then you find out the law professor asks you to argue the other side. Some people say, law students often say, you lose your soul in your first year of law school. And what they mean is, what you thought were your values are being challenged by professors who insist that you understand the other side, that you profoundly disagree with. Why do they teach that way? Think about it. You're a practicing lawyer. You've gone into law because you want to help the underdog. People who are on workman's comp, let's say. And they've got lots of money, their employers, the doctors and so forth, the insurance companies are all against you. They want to deny workman's comp to your client. Is it enough to only know the case from your client's point of view? Or to be a good lawyer, don't you have to understand the case from the insurance company's point of view, or the employer's or the doctor's point of view, whoever turned him down? Of course you do, because if you can't anticipate it by seeing how, if you were that lawyer, you'd make this argument or that argument. If you can't, you'll be caught with your pants down in court. You won't have a clue where he's coming from. So the better a lawyer you are, the more, really and truly, you know how to argue the case from either side. Well, that's obviously part of being a lawyer. And there's another part that goes with it. You also know, as a lawyer, that, if you're going to be a courtroom lawyer, that there will be times when the judge will have to rule on points of law. And you'll have to be able to anticipate what the judge will rule. Now, of course, you'd like it to be all cut and dry. You know, the law says this, the judge rules that. But you then fairly quickly find out there are a lot of places where it's a judgment call. You've got to be able to anticipate how the judge will rule. And very often, when you're preparing your case, you don't know who the judge will be. It can't be just a matter of judge's personality. You can hope you'll get Judge X and not Judge Y. But you don't know when you're preparing your case. So you've got to be able to think about it in terms of a good judge. How a good judge would rule. Unless you know that all the judges in this particular court are terrible, then you do it another way. Froman goes further. He says, on top of those qualities that you can anticipate the other side because you can sympathize, you can detach from your own client and look at it with real sympathy from the other side's point of view, which means an affective, emotional thing as well as an intellectual thing. And aside from respect for the judge, something is needed to really be good that he calls connoisseurship in law. And he uses that word, he explains, to suggest, you know, the way a connoisseur of fine wine appreciates it. And because that connoisseur appreciates it, he or she is led to be able to make fine distinctions. I have a friend who can taste distinctions between wine that I can't get at all. I'm no connoisseur of wine because I don't really love it enough. I don't care about it enough to do the tasting, think about it. If you love it enough, you're led to be able to make fine distinctions, subtle judgments that other people won't make. That's what he means happens in the law, too. You want to see that worked out. There's a movie from a novel called Anatomy of a Murder. It's an old Jimmy Stewart black and white movie. And he plays a lawyer that I think has connoisseurship for the law. Okay, put all those together, and you've got a picture of a certain kind of character. We've talked about what virtues that character, the good lawyer, will need. Now, according to social science, value judgments aren't scientific, but we've been making value judgments all over the place. How can we do that? Come back to that. Next point, simply, Krollman argues, the good lawyer now has some qualities that are needed to be a good statesman. And he explains it in terms of, I'm now on the last page of your handout, by the way, and I'm in Roman numeral 4, and I'm talking about the business there. Krollman says, I'll explain it briefly, integrity in personal life is the same as political fraternity in a country's life. And he means it this way. Seems odd at first, but think about this. When you get a little older, or a lot older, you look back on your life, and you observe that you made some choices that you now know you would have made differently. You may already know that even in your 20s. But certainly, by the time you're in your 50s, almost everybody knows some choices I made. Unless you're totally paranoid and it was all the other person's fault all the time. Some choices I made, I really would make differently. What do you do then? You can get into a civil war with yourself. You can hate yourself. Or you can, quote, forget it. Repress it. Become neurotic. Or you can become a friend to yourself. But becoming a friend to yourself, that is to say, becoming a friend to the person who made the choice that you now think was a wrong choice, is as hard as a lawyer sympathizing with the other side. Anybody who's had one of these decisions knows it. It's not easy to be a friend to yourself about those kinds of decisions. That's what Krollman calls integrity. Precisely that quality of being able to be a friend to yourself about the decisions that you have taken, but you now are sure you wish you'd done it differently. And then he observes, look how that's got an analog in politics. Some people in politics hate the other guys just as much as the person might hate the decision that he made 25 years before. Other people in politics have a personal quality that enables them, without lessening in any way their disagreement, somehow sympathizing with the other side. Let me just illustrate just very briefly so you'll see what I mean. We've heard of secret tapes disclosing that both Obama and Romney, in private, closed conversations, characterized their critics. Recently it's Romney and the 47%, which you've all heard about, that he said are takers that are going to be on the dole no matter what. Earlier, you may have forgotten it, but early summer or last spring, Obama said something in a closed situation about, I don't remember the exact words, there wasn't a phrase like 47%, but it was a real put down of the people in the hinterland. that are generally less educated, and he described as full of resentment at people they can't understand. And of course, for all those red states out there in the hinterland, it was devastating. Now, I'm not saying that either Romney or Obama doesn't have political fraternity. I don't know. But if, I believe, if you had this quality of political fraternity, you wouldn't think that way. And so you wouldn't say it, even off the record, behind closed doors. Because you care about those people enough to understand that they aren't what Obama and Romney said. Political fraternity, in some people, is really all that holds this country together. That's required in a statesman. The combination of the judgment that the good lawyer needs and this extra quality, integrity as a person, political fraternity about the people in the country, Cronin argues to me quite persuasively, goes to make up the statesman. I found this fascinating. This is a very hard-headed lawyer. He was at that time dean of the Yale Law School, a practicing lawyer, parenthesis. He's so discouraged about the law that he retired from the law school, and now he teaches liberal arts in the undergraduate school at Yale. Wrote a good book called The End of Education. He's very discouraged about the way things are going. But in this book, I was teaching and I was absolutely convinced. This is all factual. This can be known. But my whole graduate training and the whole methodology, or if you will, ideology of the social sciences and of our culture says you can't know these things. That's just your opinion. That's just your subjective judgment. That's just your value judgment. So here I am teaching things that to me are really exciting, and I know go against that kind of scientism, but I don't know how to explain it. To my rescue came a really remarkable philosopher, the late, well, actually I don't know, he retired, I don't know if he's died or not, Alistair McIntyre.
Very much alive still.
Is he? Good. Good. And he wrote a book published in 1981 called After Virtue, which to me was like a comet moving through the sky. I want to just briefly show you how he defined some concepts in such a way that I could see it would be very difficult, even for a scientist, to deny that this is real, this is objective. What McIntyre did was to ground values in what he called practices, and I've written out his full definition right there in Roman numeral 5a on the last page of your handout. Practices are those cooperative forms of activity whose participants jointly pursue the goods internal to those forms of activity and jointly value excellence in achieving those goods. You read that about 10 times and you start to see what he's saying. For me, illustrations always help. These are his illustrations. The activities of members of string quartets, the crews of fishing fleets, of architects and construction workers jointly engaged in developing good housing, of members of families making and sustaining the familial community, of farmers and of physicists. And a diverse range of practices. But those internal goods of a practice are virtues. A scientist, the physicist, has to value the pursuit of truth in order to do the kind of work that other scientists will honor and respect. Imagine if a physicist were to say, well, I know we're supposed to value the truth, but I really care about my reputation and getting ahead, so I'm going to cheat. Sciences in history, it occasionally happens. They get caught. And they're humiliated and thrown out of the profession. That's an enforcement mechanism by people who do not believe that those values are just subjective. Isn't it interesting? McIntyre offers you a theory of how that makes sense. When I read this book, After Virtue, I just It was really funny. I was so excited. I wrote up a summary, a 4 or 5 page summary of every chapter in the book, and I invited about 15 faculty friends at the time in all different departments. I said, please come and talk with me about this. It's just really exciting. So most of them came. And we had this great discussion, and it was perfectly clear, for some of us, this was like, you know, discovering the other side of the moon or something like that. And then others said, I remember Franz Schneider in the English department said, so what's new? Had a traditional Catholic philosophical education in Europe. Nothing new. I was stunned. It was amazing to me. People who had had the traditional Catholic education found MacIntyre a new way of saying what they already knew. And those of us who'd been conditioned by the positivism, logical positivism, and other methodologies in postmodernism, were finding it really exciting, which is an important clue to where I'm going here. Then MacIntyre later, he was criticized in his book because he was, after Virtue, because he was presupposing some sort of notion of practical reason. And everybody in philosophy knew that that was a highly debatable point, and what did he mean by practical reason? So he wrote a whole book, an amazing book, called Whose Justice, Which Rationality, in which he argued that there's a completely different conception of practical reason in the Aristotelian Thomistic tradition, from that in the Augustinian tradition, from that in the Humean tradition, from that in the liberal, as to say, 17th, 18th century liberal tradition. And he explained them all. So, story on myself. I tried reading that book while I was teaching. I tried and tried. I broke my head on that book. I could not stay awake, literally. I'm very self-disciplined about that kind of thing. I could not read it. I retired, picked up the book. I could read it. It was incredible. Somehow the mental shackles were gone in my monastery without walls. In this book, Whose Justice, Which Rationality, MacIntyre does something else that I really was amazed at. I'd heard the notion of a highest good, summum bonum. I thought of it, as I suspect most people in the modern world do, as something medieval. I can quote to you from the most famous liberal political philosopher in the second half of the 20th century, John Rawls, in which he says, anybody who could sum up all of his desires and values in one highest good must be a little bit crazy from the liberal pluralist point of view. Must be a little bit crazy. But in the traditional conception of practical reason, that's essential. You have to be able to think in terms of a highest good. Well, I'd never been able to make any sense out of it. And MacIntyre, with his genius, said, here's why. You're trying to compare various goods. You'd like to have a good sex life. You'd like to be a great lecturer. You'd like to relax. All these different things. And also, you'd like to be a serious Christian, not the kind of half-time Christian you are, and so on and so forth. And you think to yourself, how do I put all these things together? You got to weigh them all out. And MacIntyre explains, what you mean by a highest good is that which, by definition, can't even be compared with all the other goods. It's incommensurable with the other goods. As soon as you grasp that idea, I have to read Whose Justice, Which Rationality two, three more times. It's incredible. I all of a sudden understood how to think in my own life of my highest good, which I had never been able to do before, ever. That's some philosophy. Then you can think about a whole life. If you've got a highest good, you can also think about a whole life, because the highest good would take in all the parts of your life. Well, I, like I suspect most of you, always lived in compartments. I was very conscious of it. One time we wrote a little diagram for my son when he was about 30. He said, my life is like this, and I'd draw a big rectangle. Over here was a circle called home, and over here was a circle called work, and there's dots in the other places. And I said, I think I'm most myself in those dots, but I'd like to make it all be together, but I don't know how. That's what compartmentalization is like. McIntyre's notion of practical reason with its highest good, in a wonderful, wonderful lecture he gave, which was published as an article, Plain Persons and Moral Philosophy, explains how you solve those problems. So I'm reading this and I'm realizing this really, really makes sense to me personally and to think about objectively. But since I'm not Catholic, I was a little suspicious. McIntyre converted to Catholicism. The other philosophers I was reading, as I mentioned before, were Catholic. Is this something that only Catholics get? And then along came, to my rescue really, obviously non-Catholic philosopher, Alan Donegan. I don't know for sure, but I've read his stuff and I'm certain he's not Catholic. At least not traditional Catholic. He can't buy traditional Catholic metaphysics, but he was invited to give the Aquinas lecture at Loyola in Chicago. And what he did was, it's just amazing. He explained why he thinks Thomas Aquinas is right without using any metaphysics. He does it in an analytical philosophy way, the way a modern person can think if you really go slowly through philosophy. He says, the thing that's hard about it, the book is called, the lecture is called Human Ends and Human Action. He says, what's hard to grasp about Aquinas is he keeps talking about the telos, the end. And you think that's out in the future. You know, pie in the sky, by and by. I'll get to heaven. That's what I want. It's in the future. And you think to yourself, well, you can't live a life if you're just living for the future. That doesn't make any sense. Donegan explains, Thomas understood and explained that the end of life for the highest good, the end is not only in the future, it is in the present as a conditioning reality on what you're doing. Donegan explains it like this. Simple example. You're playing tennis. Your opponent is starting to beat you. You've played him before. He usually beats you. You really want to win. Break point, he smashes a hard ball to your backhand. You go for it. You can see it's in, but you can't reach it. But your body is between the official and the ball. He calls it out. What do? Well, some of us would say, great, I won the point. Others of us would say, no, you're wrong, I saw it, it's in. Are they crazy? Those who would do that. No, they're not crazy. They have an end. For them, tennis has an end, but it's here in the present, conditioning what they're doing as they play. And so, because he's not there only to win, he wants to win at tennis. He says, it's in. This is the way, the example that Donegan used to explain what Thomas means, cutting through all the metaphysics. And then Donegan, because he can't argue that, or doesn't want to try to argue that way, he then goes to the 18th and 19th century philosophers that he thinks did the best without Thomas's notion of an end, or telos, to talk about ethics. Immanuel Kant and Sidgwick in England. And Donegan knows them both very well, and he explains remarkably clearly how both of them just end up contradicting themselves and making no sense. And that's his way of saying, I can't do traditional Catholic metaphysics, but this looks like the best thing going to me. And from my point of view, then, I could say, oh, it's not just for Catholics. So I could overcome my parochial limitations and say, I think I'm starting to get it. But McIntyre says two things that made it really hard for me to stop with him. One was, he said that politics in America is not a practice. So everything I wanted to do with the notion of practice didn't go to work, according to him. And the other thing he said is, all these ideas and concepts that I've explained to you really need to be explained in terms of a metaphysics, which is just what I've been hoping to avoid. So, I'm not going as fast as I wanted to. I was led, I think I'm about out of my time. Let me sum it up. What I was going to do in 5B and C is explain Bernard Lonergan on knowing and how I realized that I do that, and explain how you can shift from your usual scientific notions of knowing to a different kind, which I'd love to explain to you if there were time. Okay. And then gave a proof of the existence of God, which is perfectly logical, but I couldn't understand at all. If the universe is completely intelligible, God exists. But the universe is completely intelligible. Therefore, God exists. I got the syllogism. I didn't know what sense to make out of those, either the major premise or the minor premise. Well, then, a wonderful book that I really recommend to you by J.C.C. Smart and J.J. Haldane, called Atheism and Theism. It's really good. It's not the new atheist. I mean, it's really good. Two serious metaphysical philosophers. I wanted to explain to you how reading that book finally let me understand everything that's going on, and how really and truly metaphysics can be entered into with as much rigor and as much truthfulness and as much logic as science can, which was where I got my IT. And so, although I don't fancy that I'm a serious metaphysician, I now know I can read it and I can think it. That then brings me back to the political part. We've got to talk about the common good. Armed with metaphysics, I know how to explain to you, if there were time, that the common good is real, even though you can't see it, you can't observe it by empirical science methods, and it's not always in existence. It's still real. It emerges out of a certain kind of conversation, which Alexander Passerand-Dontrev explains in his book, The Notion of the State, which I could never understand, this traditional Catholic natural law. But I could never understand it until I got the metaphysics. Once you get the metaphysics, it's perfectly clear that what Dontrev is talking about is, here's the way, the practice, if you will, that you use in order to find out what the common good is. I see lots of you frowning and looking puzzled, and that's just where I would be if I hadn't done all the stuff that I haven't said to you. One part of it, just one part, to give you a sense. How can something be real if it doesn't exist? I learned that in mathematics. In mathematical game theory, in the simplest kind of three-person game. I'll show you if you want, if you're interested, afterwards I can do it on the board. In the simplest kind of three-person game, there are three different outcomes possible. But only one can occur. But it's proved with mathematical certainty that all three are possible, equally possible. And when von Neumann and Morgenstern say, I know you're wondering, in what sense can these others be real? They say, oh, well, it's obviously virtual reality. Their existence, their potential existence exerts a pressure like gravity on the people in the game, so that they'll think in terms of the existence of the other possible outcomes, even if they aren't achieving them. It's all mathematical. Wonderful. Well, if you can do that in mathematics, then it makes perfect sense to say the common good is something that is potential. It can become actual under certain conditions. You can say what the conditions are. It's a reality. if we had that conversation, then I'd come back to the election and I'd say, I think I can tell you something about qualifications for the president and something about the policy. That's the very bottom of the outline that you have on the first page of the handout. Just briefly, I want to explain to you why, in a nonpartisan, totally value-free way, I can explain running Bain Capital is not a qualification for being president. Precisely the qualities that are needed to be that kind of venture capitalist disqualify from being president. The usual and easy way of saying this is, a country isn't a corporation. But another way of saying it is, who really did a better job? Mitt Romney at Bain Capital, or the owner of an enterprise in Minnesota, in a small town, that employed about 1,000 people and was the backbone of his town's economy? And instead of outsourcing and going overseas, he did other things to cut his costs, got his workers to accept pay reduction, kept all 1,000 of his employees going and the town alive. That's not what Mitt Romney was doing at Bain Capital. But that's the quality you want to have in the president. On the other hand, I want to explain the Democrats, and that includes Barack Obama's fatal tendency to make fun of people who believe in God, and or if they mention it, to do so as an afterthought. You all probably read that when Obama found out that somebody was saying the Republican platform mentions God 20 times, the Democrats don't mention it at all, Obama went back and told them they had to put the word God in. What that says is, Obama doesn't really have political fraternity with all the people in the United States for whom God is real and important. That is, I believe, and I think you can see what I'm getting at, to say that Obama is not qualified to lead those people. His instinctive judgments, even when he's making them and not his political advisors, his instinctive judgments, political judgments, ignore what those people care most about. I'm sure we could get into that soon.
So are you recommending that we vote for Roseanne Barr then?
Let me just finish up with one thing. This also will be controversial. I'll give you a chance to throw things at me. Abortion today is an issue that is as important and as right now insoluble as slavery was in the 1850s. Most of you probably have never thought about this. But the moral issue was clearly you're either an abolitionist or you're a slave owner. You're either pro-life or you're pro-choice. Lincoln's genius, real genius as a statesman, was to find a compromise that said slavery is a moral evil, but allowed slave owners, if they were willing to accept compromise, to keep their slaves for the time being. He only limited it, but put it on the road to extinction. The compromise, the Lincoln-esque compromise on abortion would, of course, be that abortion is clearly identified as evil, and then in some way the reasons why people have abortions are addressed in the way that Lincoln addressed the concerns of the slave owners. That would unite the country. Whereas now, the two poles, P-O-L-E-S, not P-O-L-L-S, the two poles, the extremes on either side, dominate the debate and nothing gets done. But a Lincoln as compromise, I think, change our politics. And so I'll stop there.
Thank you, Michael. The Socratic Club here at Gonzaga, like the Oxford Socratic Club, prizes conversation, and to do that, to prompt conversation, our practice is to have a commentator, and Doug Crease of the philosophy department, who is a very common feature at the Socratic Club. We'll have a couple of remarks here, and then we'll open up for questions and discussion. Doug?
Well, first of all, I wanted to thank Professor Leiserson for being with us. And I suppose we all take different things from his talk. I was particularly excited about that part where he said that when he retired, suddenly these books that were impenetrable before became clear. And it makes me look forward to the idea of retiring as soon as possible. I have a series of comments. They're meant more to prompt further questions. They are sort of ad hoc and not a systematic statement on these matters. First of all, there was the part at the beginning of the presentation which was in a way kind of sad when Professor Leiserson was talking about that he now thinks that his work in teaching political science in some way cheated his students because he didn't want to, in those days, address directly the question of what is good or of the good. I think the good part about that is that all of Professor Leiserson's students that I have ever met didn't feel cheated at all about his courses, so I hope you don't lie awake at night worrying about that. But he does point out, okay, that modern social science attempts, or at least it says it attempts, to try to prescind from conversation about what is good. It wants to do facts and not address questions of values. Whether that's, I guess I would wonder if even political scientists or social scientists really believe that. Young people at the university often tell me things like this, that they don't think that it's possible to have conversations about what is good, to come to value judgments, and so there's no reason to talk about these things. And I usually let them go on for a moment, but you know, if you mismark their paper or something like that, they're quite sure that you are unjust, and suddenly morality is back with a vengeance. I don't think people really live prescinding from judgments about what is good. Nevertheless, you know, I go to the American Political Science Association meetings from time to time, every 3-4 years. And indeed, it is astonishing how there are aspects of this massive convention where things like the good are not permitted to be discussed at all. Fortunately, there are also, there's an area in political science now called, they call it political theory. We would have called it political philosophy, and I can find a home among those people very well, almost in some ways better than in philosophy. So I wonder if maybe there's a certain amount of retrenchment with respect to this fact-value distinction. So that would be one thing that we could discuss, whether anybody who lives this way. A second thing that we could talk about is Professor Leiserson raised this question of political fraternity, or the ability to sympathize with the other side as being a necessary quality of a good leader or a statesman. And that's a good point. I didn't exactly know what was going to be said this afternoon. Or I would have been better prepared, but I did notice in the news today, I guess last night or Tuesday night, there was a dinner held in New York, the Al Smith dinner, which is meant to be a moment of jocularity and goodwill in the middle of campaigning, and both the president and the governor attended, and of course you get to tell jokes about each other. I should have brought some of these in. I remember one of Obama's lines was that he enjoyed coming to New York. He'd gone shopping that afternoon in some of the stores. Governor Romney had gone shopping for some stores. One of Romney's better lines, at least I thought so, was that he said, tomorrow the headlines are going to read, Obama eats with Catholics, Romney dines with rich people. They're at the same dinner. Okay, so, but both men at least said something very gracious toward each other. They complimented each other on having fine families and family. So perhaps it was heartfelt. And perhaps it occurs to me that candidates are the way they are because the voters are the way they are. And it may be the case, I'd like to think it's the case, that perhaps candidates such as this do have more charitable feelings towards each other. But these don't get expressed because citizens don't have more charitable feelings towards each other. In other words, to some extent, we get the candidates we deserve. And if we're worried about our candidates, we have to start by being worried about ourselves, it seems to me. Then a comment on McIntyre. I can remember when McIntyre's book first came out. I was still in graduate school, a couple years younger, Professor Leiserson, when we read it for a class, and I can remember my response was exactly that of Frank Schneider's. What's news about this? Was there anything here that anybody didn't know? I was glad that McIntyre was finally catching on to news, but I couldn't for the life of me understand why it was such an important book. But he does explain, does Professor Leiserson. He's very clear that this was, at the time, it was a very earth-shaking book. And then I thought I wanted to say just a little bit about what he was saying about the common good or the telos notion to get across to students, just the rudiments of the idea of a common good. And I thought Dr. Leiserson was quite right in explaining the incommensurability of the common good with respect to all other goods. Aristotle, it seems to me, explains this whole thing rather well. But of course, Aristotle is not perhaps always all that accessible. Two homey examples that I sometimes use to try to explain the matter to students is by pointing out that the common good strictly speaking, isn't material. Okay, so you know, if I had an apple here and I gave it away to another person, I wouldn't have it anymore. And if I had $10 and I gave it to someone else, I don't have it anymore. It seems that with respect to these goods that are material or have a basis in material, they can't really be shared. But if I have an idea and I give that away, I still have it. I can share an idea with lots and lots of people, and it's still my own. So in order for there to be a real common good, a shared kind of good, it has to be more than the sum of the material goods. If the good is material, you know, more is better and most is best. And then the task is to get the biggest pile possible. But if the good is immaterial, then we can all share in it. Another way to get this across is, and this is pure Aristotle, but I think here. Aristotle explains that the advantage of virtue is that if one pursues virtue for oneself, one winds up helping everybody else, so that you don't have to choose between helping yourself and helping others. The Boy Scout helps the little old lady across the street. Well, who gets the most out of the deal? Well, okay, the old lady gets across the street, but the Boy Scout got to do an act of virtue. Now, probably the little old lady really didn't need help anyway, so maybe she gets the real advantage because she helped the young man help himself in that way. But do you see, if the good that we are pursuing is the kind of thing that can be shared, then we get to do what's precisely in our own advantage and helping everyone else at the same time. To go back to my example about the $10 bill, okay? If I give it away, even to someone who's really hungry, okay, like my young seminarian advisee, okay? Well, who gets what out of the deal? Maybe he gets a meal, but I got to do a good deed. Aristotle's very clear that I got most out of it, that I got the better part of the bargain. Well, if the good is somehow like that, if the common good is somehow like that, then it is possible that we could pursue such a thing. And then finally, I'll go back and just, well, two more quick comments. The Lincoln-esque compromise, I mean, it seems that there's one could legitimately point out that didn't work out so well. However wise it may have been at the moment, it wasn't effective, I guess. We have to point out, and that, you know, something we have to think about. And then one final thought, something that occurred to me. You know, this criticism of social science, as many of us know, but maybe some don't know, questions about the core curriculum at Gonzaga are uppermost in the minds of at least many faculty here right now. And Dr. Calhoun and I put forth last year a proposal about reforming the core. The fact of the matter is that the university's accreditors want there to be social science in the core curriculum. The university's accreditors, it's remarkable how much they want our core curriculum to match that of the University of Washington. And the University of Washington has social science as part of their curriculum. So we should too. And so our thinking about this was that, you know, the best way to introduce social science into the core curriculum of a place like Gonzaga University was precisely to pair it with something like ethics and moral theology. And so in our little proposal, we tried to put those as, to sort of link those courses together as a little trilogy, if you will, for students to take. So, I think it's best to permit others to ask more questions. If you could follow up with some of the things that I've said, I hope they spur questions in your own mind. And I know Dr. Leiserson will be very generous in trying to answer.
Perhaps we could begin with the question that the gentleman here asked already about, you've suggested to us that politics is practical. You've suggested to us that we can bring principles of the common good, and yet, if we're wondering who we should vote for, right, this is your question, we've got two unsatisfactory candidates in the major parties. What do you think about that, Dr. Leiserson?
Well, remember that the title was "What Would Jesus Do?" I would quote Jesus saying, "Who set me up as a judge over you? Go and make your own decision."
Other questions, please.
Yes, please.
Going on that point, it seems like the situation that we're in now kind of goes back to your point at the beginning here, and that if there are two unsatisfactory candidates, we have a choice to perhaps vote for somebody who we think does embody political fraternity, or choose somebody who's either Mitt or President Obama. And so I guess what my point is that it would, just like in any game theory problem, you're ultimately taking a risk to go for something that you really think is right, or settle for something lesser, but that might be more opportune or easier to achieve. And so I guess with that situation, the moral element of that is, as individuals and then in the community as Americans, engaging in a practical situation, I guess if we do settle for somebody who doesn't embody political fraternity, doesn't that demonstrate a much bigger problem in the sense that we become a nation of settlers? And I don't mean in the pilgrim sense, but as people who are satisfied with something less than that incommensurable bit.
I think the question you're raising, as I understand it, does come to some of us, and for some of us it's present all the time, the question of whether, in our own judgment, the two-party system is capable of offering up a choice that, for us, really seems desirable on balance. I confronted that in 1968, very active in the anti-war movement, when the Democratic candidate, Hubert Humphrey, said his platform was that he'd continue the war just like Nixon. I couldn't choose between them. And so I voted for so-called Peace and Freedom Party, which I think got less than 2% of the vote. But it was, as you say, it was a sign of my profound alienation from the American political system at that point. And I knew it was. And I lived it as that. I think that's what you said, it's just right.
Yeah, I guess some friends and I get together and we talk about this, and once in a while somebody will say, oh, well, if you vote for that guy, you're ultimately taking a vote away from so-and-so. But in the end, it just doesn't seem like our goal is to place somebody in a position, but rather to uphold principles. And if we lose in that process, I think there can still be good to be found. It just might be discovered later on down the road.
Well, certainly the fact that the abolitionists kept running candidates in the so-called Liberty Party in the 40s and 50s expressed their principles, but the main political effect that it had was to make the Southerners more intransigent. So I'd suggest there are other ways that one could come at it. For example, you could think of the year 2000, when there was a third-party candidate, Ralph Nader. The election was very, very close. Gore got more popular vote. Bush got more in the Electoral College. In Florida, which was the key battleground state, if the Nader votes had gone for Gore, and the exit polls said 2/3 of them would have, Gore would have won Florida outright. Bush would have been defeated, there would have been no problem, there would have been no Supreme Court decision, and we never would have had a war in Iraq. So you do want to think about it. At least in the year 2000, it was very, very meaningful that a lot of people said, Tweedledum and Tweedledee, I'll vote for Ralph Nader. And we got a war in Iraq.
So you mentioned the T-loss of the political system. I definitely agree with that. We can't vote if we don't have one. But it seems like restructuring that or rediscovering that, or however you would word it, would take a lot, and more than we can do in like between now and November. So how do you vote in the absence of a T-loss for the political system?
Are you a student at Gonzaga?
Yeah.
I guess you'd take Professor Priest's course.
Wait, before November?
It's a good question. I think in the next 3 weeks. I don't know how to answer.
Okay, I'll flip it home.
Maybe this is a point question. Professor Leiserson, you began your talk by saying that the presidential elections are important, and then you explained, of course, that we had to know what they mean and so forth. The example that you used here of the Iraq War is a question of foreign policy. But if we prescind from the question of foreign policy for a moment, I kind of find it problematic that, in fact, presidential elections count for so much, right? This is supposed to be one branch of the government. It's supposed to be kept in check by the checks and balances, and of course the Bill of Rights and so on and so forth. You find just the growth of presidential power to be a worrisome thing for our regime.
I think when you're talking presidential power, you're really talking about an issue of institutions rather than individuals.
Yes.
The reason why the president is so much more powerful than he was, say, a century ago is that there are all kinds of, the cabinet is bigger, there are all sorts of bureaucracies that work for him. It's now streamlined so he can exercise much more control over it all. That's what you're talking about. And also Congress has abdicated a lot of power to the president itself. I don't think that's about individuals, though. I think the choice of the individual is just separate. And I don't know how to answer it for sure, but I think that some Republicans, but I doubt really if it's Mitt Romney, some Republicans would say, vote Republican because our candidate will want a constitutional, which is to say, weaker president. I doubt very much if Mitt Romney really thinks that way. From what I've seen. But as we all know, Mitt Romney was a centrist, and then he satisfied the Republican base, and now he's a centrist again. So I noticed recently that a very interesting fellow who teaches law at Harvard, named Charles Freed, who was Ronald Reagan's, as president, Solicitor General, who argues cases before the Supreme Court. Very conservative Republican. Charles Freed said, when asked if he was going to vote for Romney, Napoleon said, a man who will say anything will do anything. I don't trust him. I think that's an important consideration, too.
Would you not agree that Jesus was pro-life?
Certainly.
And so we have a very stark difference in these two systems. Would you also agree that one is pro-life and one is not?
You mean the two systems, the Democrats and Republicans? I'm not quite sure, honestly, where Obama is. I think the Democratic Party It has its own extreme base, just as the Republicans do. And so when it's looking to its base, it sounds like it's rigidly pro-choice. And exactly what policy is followed depends on the particular person. What I think really is tragic is that no one, right now, each party wants to stay with the extremes. They aren't, I don't think, seriously interested in a Lincoln-esque compromise. I think that's tragic. I think that's really having terrible effects on our politics. And I would say, if Doug was serious about it didn't work, I would want to say, Lincoln set that up so that if the South rejected his compromise, he would win the election and the South would lose the Civil War and slavery would end. Lincoln's compromise was a very carefully calculated compromise in this sense. He knew that either the South would have to accept its eventual elimination, slavery, or the South would secede, in which case he, Lincoln, would win. The South would secede and there'd be a civil war, and then slavery would disappear. That's the kind of compromise I had in mind. I wrote a paper on this one time, I'd be happy to share it.
How does that exhibit the political fraternity? If that's accurate.
Lincoln's idea was, he was so aware, after all, Lincoln grew up in Kentucky and southern Indiana, and he knew what slave owners felt like. He'd seen it. He was so sympathetic to, and his wife's family, actually many of his in-laws were slave owners. He was so sympathetic to it that he was quite prepared to allow Southerners to keep their slaves. The abolitionists hated Lincoln. Hated Lincoln because he was a compromiser on it. And it was precisely because he was willing to let the Southerners keep their slaves. All he asked them to do is to admit that slavery violated the Declaration of Independence. He kept coming back to that over and over again. You can have your slaves if you'll admit that it's immoral, if you admit that it's evil. If you can figure out a compromise like that, you won. And the South knew it, and that's why they seceded. Please.
I think in this election, it's somewhat of an important thing. How are we going to determine which is morally superior, capitalism or socialism? There's two directions that we may want to go.
In this election?
Yeah, or any election.
I don't think we've got a choice like that. Do you mean that Obama's a socialist?
Yeah.
What's a socialist? Somebody who believes in public ownership of private property? That's the traditional definition of a socialist.
Primarily the redistribution of wealth idea.
He believes in a progressive income tax?
Yeah.
Well, then, for the whole 20th century, a majority of Americans are socialists. If that's the definition of socialist, most Americans during the whole 20th century believed in a progressive income tax, supported it. You want to go slowly when you use the word socialist. Okay? You want to make a distinction. What England had in its Labour Party was a socialist party. They really believed, after World War II, in public ownership of property, and they set about doing it. Obama isn't like that. But if all you mean by socialist really and truly is progressive income tax, I don't think it's a very historically helpful definition, but I think you run into the problem that right then, you've got to explain to all the Americans who like a progressive income tax that they're wrong.
Can we input in that?
Sure.
You know, I think we kind of put the gentleman on the spot very quickly, but as my wife just pointed out, look at what Obama has done with GM. He's basically turning private property into public property. With several of the banks, he's been selecting different companies to give huge amounts of money. So he's basically, on his own, deciding who the winners and losers in society. I think that supports the Donald Trump.
Obamacare, swimming across many other examples.
I was wondering if Obamacare would be an example of what you mean by socialism, even though he deliberately set it up to be like Mitt Romney's plan in Massachusetts, in which case Mitt Romney as governor was a socialist, which is a little problematic. But even if you continue, I can see that argument. It would be the argument that would say the New Deal. Franklin Roosevelt was socialist. And you'd have the same problem again. Franklin Roosevelt ran in 1936 on his New Deal. And he won majorities in all the 2 states, the biggest landslide in our history, until Ronald Reagan. So if that's socialism, then at that time, Americans were all socialists.
Dr. Leiserson?
Yes.
If you think of if I'm thinking of what's the common good, and I think of it in terms of the whole world, I feel that the United States has really been important for the last 200 years to protect other smaller, weaker countries, peoples, all that. We're just as bad as everybody else, but overall, it seems like we've been really instrumental in helping. We've done wrong things, but we've done a lot of right things. And so if your idea, or my idea, is that it's important for us to stay strong, but I see one of the candidates as being his political fraternity goes a little too far for me because he wants to have everybody be more the same on equal footing. How do we adjudicate that? I feel like we need to be strong and we need to be powerful so that we can continue to do what's right, more so than leaving it to who else.
As someone said, when you get into foreign policy, you really do start raising a whole other set of questions. I think in this election, what you've got is 2 people who agree with you that the United States has been a force for good in the world, okay, but have different notions about how to continue that under the circumstances that we live in now. My own personal opinion is that they differ not on ends but on means, and we would have to get into the details of that to really do anything. I think they agree with the end sketched out.
Professor, would you, I know we're getting close on time, but would you just generally, when we're talking about how Christian philosophy should inform politics, speak to the issue of how one should weigh prudential issues such as different pathways to help the poor versus, moral issues, for instance, the culture of life and that sort of thing. How one should look at that if one wants to bring a Christian perspective to a political choice.
Well, your question, I may not answer it the way you want, but to me, it connects up with what Doug was talking about, the core curriculum, and the notion of pairing a social science course with an ethics course or an applied theology course. And I'd like to just briefly sketch out why what I was talking about is different from that. I think what that does is to capitulate to the same old notion that the facts are amoral and then we should apply our values to them. Whereas I think really traditional Catholic thinking, Christian thinking, wanted to say, certainly Thomas Aquinas wanted to say, that grace perfects nature. It doesn't contradict it or something like that. So the example I was giving you of Croman and the Good Lawyer and the Statesman, notice the difference. One could say, oh, well, we've got to have lawyers, but what we ought to do is have an ethicist and a theologian be in the law school and teach them what they ought to do. That's one thing you could do, but it just reinforces their notion that what they're doing is amoral. What Croman is doing is trying to show how the values really and truly could be in their practice. That's the approach that I think is, for me at least, is much more persuasive as a Christian that cares about God's creation. I think it's good. I think what we do can be understood as a value, but our culture doesn't do that for us anymore.
Based on this, how you concluded that when you have a cult, in the culture that I find, at least I find myself in, like when I'm from Seattle, that's where I'm from the seminary for, and we have certain issues on the ballot that are hard, that are very filled with emotion and all these things. How is it though that you can, at least as me as a Catholic and a future priest, how is it that I can, like maybe on the ground level, help people understand, for example, this understanding of teleological thinking? Because if I want to talk about natural law with somebody from here to the common streets of Seattle, they don't really have any conception of that, right? So I sound like just a complete stranger a lot of the times with that. And I already know that they would, reject some other methods of argumentation for that. But I mean, in your experience, how is it that you can reintroduce friends or family or whoever to at least consider the concept of teleological thinking about the common good? That's the real. It's not just, there's not this fact value distinction. It's not,
I would do just what my example of the Lincolnist compromise suggests. I've read about some foundation-funded projects where they bring people together in like a focus group that's half pro-life and half pro-choice. They have very set opinions. They don't cease being pro-life or pro-choice, but in the process of talking with each other, they find out that the people on the other side aren't demons, but are human beings. And then they start talking about, the pro-choice people start saying, I think it's really wrong. I would never do it myself, but. And then the pro-life people start saying, oh, so you're not really so much in disagreement with me as I thought you were. Well, I thought I was in disagreement with you. Well, what are you saying? Is it evil or isn't it? And what I've read from these things shows that if an approach like that is taken, people can find out, not people who don't want to hear, but people who aren't completely closed, can find out that almost everybody agrees that abortion is an evil. And I think it's possible to get there, and then from there, you can talk about then what do we do.
Well, the conversation could continue, but it is 5:30. Let's thank our speaker and commenter.